All right, good afternoon, or yeah, right at good afternoon. We're after 12 now. Thank you all who joined yesterday and who could join again today. Briefly, I had spoken yesterday about our Hurricane Michael grant program that applies to certain counties. There is information on our website, and I'm going to share that link in the chat. I'm also going to share a link to the Alabama Historical Commission's Historic Preservation Initiative map. On this map, you can go into our website, open up a link, and it takes you to a Geographic Informational Systems GIS map. And in there, you can search for a certain address and it'll show up if it's on the Alabama Register, if it's been surveyed. You can look up the National Register nomination if it's been listed. So I'll include that in the chat as well. But we're going to get started, and Lisa is going to lead us all. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Paige. I appreciate it. Some of you may have been with us. All of you may have been with us yesterday. Some of you may just be joining us for this first day. So we'll do a little bit of overview before we get into our presentations. I just want to recognize that we have with us Kimberly Rose, who will be talking about public engagement in the disaster resilience process, and Jeff Rosenberg, who will be taking us through a terrific design adaptation, disaster adaptation exercise, which is really kind of the highlight usually of these particular disaster resilience camps. So welcome to Camp Resilience. Many of you saw this information yesterday, but if you didn't manage to put it in or you're joining us for the first time, this training does qualify for continuing education credits. AIA members' name and member number in the chat box, and APA members are responsible for self-reporting. Let Marie, who you can just send an email to in the chat, or excuse me, send your information to in the chat, know if you need a certificate of completion. And any questions you want to pose either during the presentation or information or clarification, please go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand, and one of us will recognize you. Again, if this is your first time today and you weren't participating yesterday, it's really helpful for us to know where you are working, living, what organization you represent. Have you experienced a natural disaster yourself or in your community, and how did it impact you or your community? We have a poll that's up at this point in time as well. And if you all can just answer that, again, we're trying to get a sense of your role in your community, whether it's staff, commission member, you deal with emergency management or anything else. And for that other, just go ahead and after you've completed this, put that in the chat so that we know and can better track the types of professions or expertise that we're pulling into these trainings. Extremely helpful for us. As many of you know, we are doing this NAPC in partnership with the National Park Service. For those who did not meet me yesterday, I'm Lisa Craig. I'm principal with the Craig Group, which is the consulting firm dealing with preservation planning, as well as disaster resilience planning and training. So glad to be working with NAPC on this. Looks like we are still getting in a few. Okay. So looks like we've got a good mix. Be interested in seeing here what some of the others, council member. If you might have seen the discussion on decision makers, it's extremely important to have our elected officials involved, planning agencies, regional planning agencies. I think that's critical as well, since I tend to work with communities who are working on a regional basis, particularly when it comes to county level hazard mitigation planning or networking, as is the case in Southeast Florida with a regional planning network. So it's extremely important. Again, disasters know no jurisdictional boundaries. So you need all hands on deck to work effectively, to communicate and to respond. I think, as I mentioned yesterday, really glad to see someone participating from the area of health programming, as well as community colleges. So a good representation of individuals, architects, design professionals. Great. Good to have you all attending, and we'll move on to the rest of this morning's introduction before we get started with our speakers here. Oops, sorry, I just hit the wrong stop. Okay. All right, so a couple of things were discussed yesterday, and I'll get to those in just a minute. Today's agenda starts out with that query to you all. Are there questions you have from yesterday that you would like us to address? But then we'll be moving on to a discussion on public engagement in disaster adaptation and recovery. Recovery. We talked a little bit about that yesterday and the important role that engagement with the community supports, not just in emergency management or disaster planning, but also in preservation in general. So keep that in mind. A lot of the things you'll hear from Kim can be used in general preservation education. So some good resources for you there. A break and then applying design review standards and guidelines to disaster adaptation and recovery. Jeff has some good experience with that, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Wrap up, we'll basically leave you with answering any final questions, and then kind of your what's the next steps? What do you take in your community? How do you work with your state historic preservation office to move forward with your efforts to become more resilient against disasters? Again, this is being offered by the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. Many of you are existing members of the NAPC. If you're not, this workshop will give you the opportunity to a complimentary year-long membership. And we know you'll find it extremely useful and will renew that membership. It is all about building strong local preservation programs and leaders, with the majority of our work in the area of education, training, and advocating for the needs of local and state governments. The last thing I will say about that training aspect is how critical it is for you to stay on top of this. We do have credits available, AIA and APA credits available for our annual conference as well. The session tracks in 2022 are listed here, and take note, we are going to continue to talk about community resilience, sustainability, and climate impacts. So myself and others on the team that are trainers will be presenting at the conference and engaging on specific issues of significance to your communities. Just as a reminder, since we'll be talking a bit about this concept of adapting buildings, particularly to flooding, since that's the most recent guidance provided by the Park Service, FEMA does recognize these 5 areas for adaptation alternatives or mitigation strategies. We tend to use adaptation because we do want to protect and adapt the resource to future conditions. Prevention. As a reminder, we're talking about all of the regulatory, the building codes, the policies, the economic incentives. What can you put in place, particularly at that leadership level, advocating with your decision makers to get new policies and regulations in place to support greater resilience for properties, which takes you down to the next action, which again, whether you're dealing with your own publicly owned structures and local government, or you're providing assistance to individual property owners, what are the types of adaptation strategies that can be used on individual properties? We happen to see, obviously, the elevation of the building in Charleston, in that bottom right corner. That is a property and resource protection strategy taken on by an individual property owner. Structural diversions can be something like that flood wall in Paducah, Kentucky. Again, something that is intended to protect the entire community. Public education and awareness, just these types of trainings, more of the information you'll be hearing from Kimberly today. And then lastly, natural resource protection, not just for the benefit of protecting and creating a buffer for historic sites. Those bottom 2 images show a living shoreline being put in for the Hermitage Museum and Gardens in Norfolk, Virginia. So you can see the garden wall there and the eroding shoreline. So again, a living shoreline put in place to both buffer for that historic wall and the surrounding garden, but also it's often used to ensure that important archaeological remains are not washed away or eroded away into a river or an ocean area. So again, it's important to incorporate natural resource protection as well. So these were primarily the topics we discussed yesterday: disaster preparedness planning, disaster recovery planning, adapting historic properties prior to a disaster, and then strategies and approaches, things to know about terminology and the like for rehabilitating historic properties after a disaster. So I guess at this point, before we move into Kim's presentation, I'll just open it up to any type of questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to address this particular set of 4 discussion areas that we addressed yesterday, or any other question in general before we start our presentation today? Open to that. You can place it in the chat. You can raise your hand. Anything that you'd like to discuss. Any additional information, clarification? I guess we did a pretty effective job yesterday then. So I appreciate the fact that you all have hung in with us for day 2. This is really critical, interesting information. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim and let her launch into basically our discussion on public education and engagement. Kim?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Give me just a moment to pull up my PowerPoint. Just want to make sure that it's visible. There's no weird boxes or anything. Perfect. Okay, so welcome to the Public Engagement and Disaster Adaptation and Recovery. We'll also talk about engagement and planning processes as well. My name is Kimberly Rose, as Lisa said. I am a consulting preservation associate with her firm, the Craig Group, and work on projects of resilience and in historic communities all across the nation and now internationally in Trinidad and Tobago. But I am also the co-director of the Preservation Institute Nantucket. And so I am engaged in this research in Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, and doing this research with my students and taking that information and what we learned from using Nantucket as a classroom for climate change and the effects of it, as well as affordable housing, equitable communities, and all of these kind of microcosm issues that build onto each other when we're talking about disasters and climate change, and taking that information and spreading it out to other communities and sharing that knowledge. So in this presentation, we'll talk about how to effectively communicate disaster risk, because sometimes we are dealing with grief cycles as we begin to talk about what is potentially lost and how to give space for that, how to engage the public to assess community values, communication and disaster preparedness toolkits and resources, and then public engagement of decision makers. So first, disaster risk communication is really important. It's about empowering members of the community to protect themselves and an interactive flow of information back and forth. If something's not working, your elected officials need to know. So identifying that hazard, assessing that risk, developing policy, implementation, and then evaluating the effectiveness of that policy all comes through public engagement and talking to each other to make sure that messages are being received. So yesterday we saw these 6 terms over and over and over again: engage, educate, empower, include, inform, inspire. They mean the same thing. Whether you like E's or I's, that's your prerogative. Understanding who your audience is really important in these engagement scenarios. When you have an audience, this is typically going to be more for you are telling them something, you are hoping to educate them or have them to have takeaways from that engagement event. So knowing what your goal is, what do you hope to learn yourself if you are hoping to learn anything? If it's purely just giving information, that's okay too. That's still engagement. What are the benefits of their participation? Maybe it is just the free food that they may get by participating. Maybe it's that they come away with a toolkit or they come away with an information packet. How are your audience benefiting from that knowledge? Do they need any knowledge prior? If you're talking about zoning and a new zoning ordinance that you want to go through possibly as you're going through some of the planning phases, then maybe you want your attendees to have more of that knowledge. So you may suggest, hey, if you could come prepared, if you could read this material before attending or have a little handout that they can read while you're waiting to get started, that also helps. And then looking at who typically participates in these communities and who isn't. And making sure that you're trying to reach the whole community, especially when it comes to disaster preparedness and response and climate change. This is a whole community effort like we were talking about yesterday. So making sure parts of the whole community are there or able to access the resources afterwards if they were not able to attend is really important, making that information accessible. Of course, then you have stakeholders. Stakeholders are a little bit more intensive. These are the people that are going to inform your planning purposes, informing that recovery stages, because not everybody has complete jurisdiction. You need support. And so having stakeholders such as a historic preservation office may have a stakeholder with the coastal zone management office because they're talking about resilience. It's okay to reach out because you may not have that knowledge or access to the same resources. And so that willingness to collaboration, to look at challenges, to talk about solutions, and to have that discourse back and forth is what makes stakeholders. Stakeholders also typically are engaged throughout, whereas an audience can change each engagement event. So those are kind of the differences between that. And often stakeholders, you'll actually engage on a schedule. And so we're going to play a little game called Stakeholder Audience, where I want you to put in the chat what you think this is. So this is John Englander presenting at Weather It Together lecture. Is this a stakeholder event or is this an audience event? And you can put it in the chat. You can put S or A. You don't even have to type out the full word. Audience. Perfect. So yeah, this is an audience. They're there to listen. They are there to be entertained, slightly depressed because it is John Englander, but that's okay. He tries to make it hopeful. Him and I both feel like everybody goes wah wah when we walk into the room. The next one, so this is a focus group that was done in Trinidad and Tobago at one of our projects. We are talking about a specific topic. Do you think this is a stakeholder group or an audience? Perfect. I see all the S's coming through. I like the one letters, less effort. Okay, this is a stakeholder group. We were talking about planning here. And so you see the different people around the table discussing planning both for coastal areas, for tourism. A few people are independent architects who care about planning and wanted to be in this session. It was a really interesting group, really fun group also. This is a community workshop in Texas where they listen to about a 10 to 15 minute little spiel, and then they go and do all of the stations. Is this a stakeholder group or an audience? Okay, now I see there's a little bit of a mix in some of these responses. So this is primarily audience because we aren't going to necessarily talk to these people again. We just needed the information from them, but they are informing our plan. So it's a primarily an audience, but there's a little bit of a stakeholder piece to it. And there are going to be people there that we will circle around to, especially if they're local historic preservationists or something along those lines. So it goes a little bit back and forth. And sometimes you may have stakeholders in your audience because they want to learn more, and that's perfect. It's kind of one of those squares, rectangles, not a square kind of things. So when you're doing public engagement, once again, you're looking at that whole community. And this engagement means different things to different groups. And an all hazards event, this is going to affect individuals and institutions different, and they will make those decisions based on what they need to prepare for and respond to. Therefore, community levels of preparedness, even in the same community, can vary if it's a neighborhood or a commercial district or a university. And the challenge for those that are engaged in that emergency management is to understand how to work with the diversity of groups and organizations and the policies and practices that emerge from them in an effort to improve the ability of local residents to prevent and protect and recover from and respond to hazards and threats effectively. There are 7 ways to do this public engagement. One is to have an informed plan with a clear established goal. You want to make sure that you are getting what you need out of this public engagement event, that you're understanding your audience and who else is talking to them. Is there another plan that's happening simultaneously? Should they know about the zoning? What are they saying? And who are they talking to as well? Delivering the right message is important, making sure that you're not completely doom and gloom. Because remember, once again, especially when you're talking about disaster, you may be talking to people who are dealing with a mourning process or have been through a disaster and may need to kind of process that again, and giving them time and space to do that is really important. And then, of course, being consistent. Don't second guess yourself, be confident in what you are saying, but also don't give an answer or a response when you aren't confident in that, and say it's okay to say, you know what, I need to look into that. Can I have your information and I will get back to you. Speak to their interests, not yours. So finding out what's important to them, oftentimes, a lot of times during the public engagement, the beginning of public engagement, it will be listening sessions. And just understanding and grasping what is being dealt with, what hasn't been dealt with, what's important. So being a good listener, starting that dialogue and letting it continue and building that trust is really important. Engaging soon and often. Explaining the risk, showing the impacts of climate change and disasters, sharing experiences from other locations or from, if they want to share their experiences, they're more than welcome to. Once again, avoid that doom and gloom if you can. Obviously, we're talking about disasters. There's going to be a little bit, but there's always hope. There's always recovery on the other side. If they want to talk about what happened to them and it's emotional and they're upset, give them the space to express that. If they become angry, which can happen, especially if you're talking about climate change or you're talking about disasters of the past, it can come off as aggressive or assertive, and saying, okay, thank you for your response. I appreciate it. Let me know if you want to reach out and we can talk again or something like that. Not completely shutting down the conversation, but just saying, okay, this isn't the place right now. for this type of conversation, or giving them somewhere to go and direct that not at yourself. Offer options for reducing risk. So if they're seeming hopeless, because sometimes looking at climate change, looking at disasters, there is a sense of hopelessness or a sense of loss that people can experience. Making sure that you have options available. Well, every year I have to replace my roof because of hail. And I'm really tired of it and I don't know what to do and nobody helps me. And my insurance company says they're raising my insurance rates again because of my roof replacements and everything. I just don't know what to do. Okay, here's something that you can do. Let's research this really quick on my phone so that I can get you some links or resources that you might potentially be able to look at. Because sometimes they just don't know where to direct that effort to. And encourage that discussion. Once again, hey, reach out to me if you have any more questions, or I will reach out to you with some more resources once I'm back at the office and are able to. Making sure your sources are trusted. Don't recommend contractors if you aren't sure of who they are, what they work for, that kind of stuff. Establishing those partnerships. Oftentimes, unfortunately, there are predatory contracting services that come during recovery stages. Making sure that your community has a list of trusted contractors or repair people or cleanup services so that they're not falling victim to those predatory services really helps a community. And then sharing that consistent information over and over and over again, leading up to anything and following anything that may happen. Test your message and product first. Encourage audience feedback. So if you are building a logo, what we did in Trinidad and Tobago was say, hey, which logo do you like? Of course, they chose the one that has Trinidad and Tobago on it as the one that they liked because they liked having that recognition, the brand of their island on there. Asking questions that solicit useful feedback. So making sure that your questions have a point. They're not just talking to talk to fill time, and be willing to make changes. You know, sometimes going into a community, going into a meeting, you think one way and then you're talking to them and you're like, you know what I originally thought is not actually going to be as effective as I thought it was going to be, because this policy I was not aware of, which has been buried for years and years and years, actually makes it completely different. And so making sure that you're able to kind of switch gears on occasion and have that flexibility to respond to what their needs are, and using multiple ways to communicate. And this is important for the broader audience of understanding what medium they prefer. If it's an older audience, older stakeholder group, older community, newspaper, radio, newsletters, mailers may be more effective. If it's a younger community, social media, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, commercials on Spotify, or something along those lines may be more effective. But of course, using multiple mechanisms. In Nantucket, we publish both online and in the newspaper, as well as it's mentioned at pretty much any meeting that the towns participate in. When you are creating your message and communicating that risk, once again, be concise, repetitive, give your action steps in the positive. Try to keep your action steps in 3s or 4s so you don't overwhelm and don't make it too complicated. Use your personal pronouns. Once again, people may be afraid. They may have perceptions. It can't happen here. Okay, that's okay that you think it can't happen here, but let's prepare just in case. Everybody else can prepare and help with that. If they are afraid of doing something, or they're afraid of tornadoes, or they're afraid that they can't afford to adapt their building, helping them through that and working with them to find the funding to adapt, to find the information they need. If they're afraid of contacting the wrong person, going, okay, let's look at a list of people that are trusted by us to lead you in the right direction. Give, once again, people options and avoid humor. Again, you might be dealing with people who are going through a grief process, especially in a recovery section. But even if you're talking to somebody years down the line, they may have lost a family member, they may have lost their home that was a generational home. And so avoiding humor is always a good idea, just to make sure that you're being respectful of their space, of their emotions. Now, when you're looking at recovery, there are 10 steps to prepare for disaster recovery. So this is just an example from the National Trust. So it has nice little easy 10 steps to prepare, how to create your disaster plan, your insurance, printing out your documents, secure your property, just little checklist of what you might do. And this is something that's really simple, just creating that checklist, having the links on there, or if it's a printed thing, having a QR code that they can just scan and find that form, fill out that form, whatever they need to do. And how to go about some of this information, making sure that it's as accessible as possible. So when you're moving into planning stages, especially at the beginning, it's about informing the public of this effort, but also a little bit of a listening session. What matters most to them? What places matter in that community? What resources matter in that community? It's amazing. In Texas, we were talking with communities and we kept hearing cemetery. It wasn't so much their built environment. It's because a lot of their cemeteries are built near water sources that flood. Same thing goes for New Orleans. Their cemeteries are really important. Of course, they have a different problem, but their cemeteries are really important there. In a community such as a neighborhood that I engaged with in Gainesville, Florida, when I was doing my master's in historic preservation, their concern was not so much becoming a National Register district. Honestly, they could have cared less about being a National Register district, and that was fine. Their concern was development and how were we going to help them stay off development. And so we pivoted from looking at National Register protection in Gainesville, Florida, to looking at zoning protection and what their zoning was like. And it turns out they were actually zoned incorrectly. Looking at those kinds of things and engaging with them and hearing that can really help shape and form directions for research and those efforts to make sure that you're creating a plan that's feasible and reasonable for that area. Now, at the conclusion of risk assessment, so once you have looked at FEMA flood zones, NOAA's projections, historic tornado tracks, and those kinds of things, you may want to report your findings to your audience and to your stakeholders to see if it aligns with what they thought was going to happen. What did they not expect? Do they think this is correct? Is there anything missing as well in this risk assessment that they think should be in there? Are we looking at vulnerable communities properly? And are we looking at language differences properly as we're moving through the risk assessment? And then when you move into developing your goals, this is when you may engage your stakeholders again and go, you know what? Here's some ideas for goals that we have. Tell us what you think. And then, do you have any ideas for others, or how do we tweak this to make it more relevant? And having them help you develop your goals, because they're going to help you achieve those goals and those objectives. Once again, if it's a historic preservation office that is looking at coastal resilience, then they may need the input of their coastal zone management agency and their zoning officer in developing those goals to make sure that their plans are aligning, and discussing those actions actions is sometimes when you get into talking to a broader audience. You may release a survey, those kinds of things, in order to engage early and often. And then in implementation, these plans are never perfect. They're not going to be the end all be all. They cannot do that. That is not possible. Unfortunately, in our world, as much as we would love to make that happen, also not everything goes according to plan. And so making sure that your progress is made public and up to date. If you have a long-term 10-year plan, you may do reviews of that plan and your progress every 2 years and release that to the public and say, here's where we stand in this planning cycle. If you have a 5-year plan, you may do a halfway through review and say, okay, this is where we've gone. This is where we're going. This is what we have left to do, just to make sure that they understand what you said and your input does matter. And we are listening to this.
Hey, Kim, I'm going to jump in just for a minute because there's a lot of things you said I think are really important. And my question and my counsel to people who want to start this process is, how do you start? And I'm glad you had that stakeholder audience exercise earlier, because we in Annapolis actually started one stakeholder at a time. Even in your own agency, I had to, for example, as chief of preservation, get my comp planner to be on board with me, because they were in the process of looking forward to the update of the comprehensive plan. So we had to feel as if we were working together and not apart from each other through the process. So sometimes you start, well, you always start in your own agency, work your way up, engage all other related agencies within your city. So at least you have a core group, or maybe even we could call it a kitchen cabinet, so to speak. But then you start to move up that chain with who you intersect with in the communities. And before you know it, you might have 30 people at the table. Keeping them engaged is back to the kind of entertainment and information sharing, and setting up a regular meeting with those stakeholders to just, this is what we're doing to address risk issues. This is a project we're working on right now, so that you can connect the dots between all of the various agencies and stakeholders. Only then did we open it to the public, because that way we had lots of information, we had lots of questions, we brought in some really entertaining speakers, we started some hands-on workshops and prioritization, but only with all of our stakeholders present. And I think that was critical, and that's how you get the buy-in. But it's really one person you start with, and you start moving up the chain, and you really can't rush this. But it's about building trust, like you talked about earlier, and informing and establishing what has to be long-term relationships when you get to plan implementation. Because step 4 in the FEMA process is how to implement the plan. And implementing the plan, again, requires everybody being on board and identifying themselves in the plan and then doing their part. So just can't underscore that enough. It's a great review of all that. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah. So once again, the beginning of the plan, asking residents, hey, what historic places are important to you? You can do this through a survey. You can do this such as the Nantucket Building with Resilience in Mind survey that we did. You can do this through a little engagement event or a little kickoff event open to the public, or an open house, and make it exciting, and they get free food, and everybody loves free food. Especially if it only takes 30 minutes of their time. That kind of thing is a really great way to just kind of get some of that beginning information and to get that momentum moving forward. It's also where you hear really interesting stories and anecdotes. And Lisa, I don't know if you want to talk about this building in New Bern.
Sure. Yeah, we did the disaster and resilience plan for New Bern, North Carolina, and one of their priorities was to really understand those most vulnerable neighborhoods, that some partially in the historic district, but a number of resources outside of the historic district. So, we went through newspaper articles, we talked to church groups, another key thing, meeting them in their community, not having them come to a meeting in City Hall. So we learned through that there was this care home for elderly African Americans, in particular, in an African American neighborhood in New Bern, and it was slated for demolition because it was one of those repetitive loss types of properties. It was not currently being used, but we soon learned that the owner of that property was actually a member of the city council, and he didn't know it was on the demolition list. And so that property itself may be the very first African-American care home in the state of North Carolina, and I don't know enough about it. So the recommendation really was not so much about don't tear it down as it was about documenting the history associated with that community and culture, and understanding more about who was part of that community, was part of that care home facility, and doing all that you could to gather that information. Again, architecturally significant or contributing resource, many changes over time, so maybe not so much that way, but the associative value of integrity, the history embodied by that particular resource is worth documenting, notwithstanding whatever decision is ever made.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, so sometimes you learn like little interesting things that wouldn't necessarily pop up in your research, and making sure that those are heard and understood and talked about, and that the community is excited to tell you about. Usually they're very forward about what they care about, which is fantastic. After that risk assessment, what historic places must be protected? This is when you get into the prioritization process, because we can't save everything as much as we would like to. If we had all of the resources in the world, all of the time in the world, then we probably could. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know when disasters are going to happen. So prioritization is really important. Moving forward with answering that question, which property or resource would be the community miss most if it was lost, can help determine this priority from the public's perspective. But there's also economic value, critical infrastructures value, cultural and social importance, and of course, public sentiment as well, that can help determine that overall value of that structure. And there are worksheets for that we discussed yesterday during that planning piece that FEMA provides, and that integrating historic and cultural resources into hazard mitigation plans document has resources on how to determine public value and public sentiment. Visual preference surveys are very effective in this. Do you value historic buildings over maritime vessels, over memorials? What do you want to save? We've done those in Nantucket, and it turns out it is mostly view sheds, waterfront properties, and cobblestone streets, as well as our museum, are really important to Nantucket. And those places are in high regard and maybe should be prioritized a little bit higher than those not in regard. But you can do this in multiple ways, through public meetings or surveys and questionnaires that list the significant structures, visual preference surveys, which have a series of photos and just ask to rank. Usually you can have them give a little bit of input. On one of the visual preference surveys I did, it was actually for streetscape materials and treatments. And so did they like the way the bricks look on this one, or the bricks look on this one? Which is more appropriate? Which looks safer? That kind of thing. And then you can always provide them space to explain their answer if they wish. Online engagement, such as posting pictures. Do you remember when, is a really great way to start conversations. Or if you're just trying to get engagement up in general, it's a really neat idea too. And it's something that I've seen the Metro Nashville archives do, is they find a photo in their archives and say, where is this in Nashville? And it causes this discussion of like, oh, well, I remember when this building was there, or that neon sign looks really familiar. I think it's East Nashville on Gallatin Road, or something like that. It can kind of begin that online engagement in a fun and lighthearted way, so that it's already established for when you need to post meetings and post surveys. So you already have that engagement moving forward. And of course, postcards and little take-home things are really fun and can help elicit response, leaving them at libraries or government offices. Even if you notice there's a local restaurant that's really popular with the locals, then asking them, hey, can I just leave this here for anybody that might be checking out and might be interested? You don't have to do anything with it, just there for them. And that kind of thing is also a really great way. Once again, a lot of times in these plans, you're developing these goals, objectives, and actions. Goals and objectives are really great for stakeholder groups because they're the ones that are going to help you through that process and by achieving those, because this is a collaborative process, especially when you're talking about disaster and resilience. And it's going to be long term. So making sure that they are implementable, they are relevant, feasible within that term strategy, within the terms of the plan, but also that somebody is there to help you with them. So for historic preservation, if you're looking at, well, we want to do a feasibility study of elevating houses on this street. Okay, well, what's your base flood elevation? Or do you have a design flood elevation already in place? How are you going to do that feasibility study? Who's doing that feasibility study? Those kinds of things might be really great to bring forward to that stakeholder group so that they can say, oh, you know what, we kind of did one already. Here's the preliminary findings from that. Build off of it if you want to, or here's some of that data that you will need for this project to complete this objective. And then talking to the public and bringing that to them, or putting it in a survey and saying, you know, rate your top 3 objectives. And then what are some actions you can think of that would help achieve that objective? So if one of your objectives is to survey a section of a community that is threatened or has been threatened previously by tornadoes or recently by a tornado, it just clipped the neighborhood and you're like, oh, we have documented it. It is mid-century modern resources. We need to document this. How do we do that? What are the actions? Well, one of the actions may be host a survey day and invite the community to come out and help you do that survey rapidly. So that way, when you get back to the office, all you have to do is fill out the forms and send them in and post the photos and do the mapping and everything else. But you don't have to go out in the field to do this survey by yourself or by only using office staff. So it's a really great way to make sure that the community is engaged, they're having fun, and that they feel like they are doing something actively as well. And then you have implementation of whatever plan, whatever event that you're doing. Determine who, what, when, and how for action implementation, who's responsible for what actions. Is it the homeowner or the property owner? Is it the city or town or county that's responsible? Is it the neighborhood association that's responsible? Is it the historic district commission that's responsible? The Main Street Committee? Who is holding that responsibility over certain actions? Where's the funding coming from to fund these actions? Can somebody apply for a grant? Is there already intrinsic or inbuilt funding for this already in the community, and you just have to put a plan so you can unlock that funding achievement? And what is the time frame for that project? So the harbor cottages at Francis Street, as you can see, they are heavily inundated by water. This is 2100 water. Francis Street is in Nantucket, where I live. By 2100, they're estimated 8.04 feet of water, and that's what those cottages would look like. Some of them have been demolished. So these, I don't know if you can see my pointer. So these have been demolished here. And then these that existed have just recently been moved as of Sunday. And that entire street corner is being widened because that is one of the only main transportation corridors from our ferry terminal to Mid-Island, where our grocery store is, all of our hardware stores, all of the things that we need to live on this island go is through this street. And so widening this corner is helping with transportation ease, so we can get semi trucks through town. The issue is this is not resilient at all. It is threatened by water and sea level rise. It is threatened by high tides at time, depending on the time of the year. If we're close to those colloquially known king tide times, it gets inundated with water. There was one time I recently got a new book about climate change and was going to take a photo with the harbor as the background, walked up, the street was flooded. I was like, oh, well, this is appropriate, I guess, to take that photo, but it happens. And so how do we make this road that we just paid money for, that is surrounded by Nantucket Land Bank properties, who is hoping to make a more resilient waterfront, that is a main transportation corridor. How do we make it resilient? How do we make it survive long enough that we can move materials to Mid-Island where they need to go? So making sure that coordination and that time frame for projects is listed and known and relevant for your projects and your planning purposes. And those were historic buildings, and luckily quite a few of them were moved. Not all was lost, which does make me feel a little bit better. And then what could be salvaged was salvaged, which is great. So making sure you have coordination built into those projects. When it comes to toolkits, there are many. You can get them from FEMA. You can get them from Department of Homeland Security. Your health organization may have a toolkit or a risk toolkit. The CDC even has a disaster risk toolkit, even though they don't necessarily deal with disasters on the frequent level that FEMA does. They still deal with some. So governments have that responsibility, and it doesn't matter what level of government, whether that is local, county, state, federal, to get that information out there. What does the public need to know about hazards? How can they act? Can they act for their household, their community? What can local governments do? What can every government do? And there's easy ways. So you can see this National Preparedness Month, Prepare to Protect, has weekly plans of, okay, week 1, make a plan. Week 2, build your kit. Week 3, low cost, no cost preparedness. So making sure that it's accessible and affordable to everyone. And then 4, teach your youth about preparedness. So how to educate that next generation and prepare them for what they may possibly face as well. We saw this information yesterday, but these are the lists of agencies and departments and services that have this information, that have these toolkits, and all you have to do is access them and read through them, fill them out if they have fillable moments, and just kind of educate yourself, educate your community, spread these resources around. It's okay if you feel, especially because capacity sometimes, especially employee capacity, is not very high in historic preservation or cultural resource fields. That's okay. Sometimes just creating a clearinghouse portion of your website and say, hey, here's some resources. Here's preparing your resources for disaster checklist that so-and-so developed, pulling even from other states such as the North Carolina Assessment and Resilience Plan, and not reinventing the wheel. That's okay. You don't have to be original when it comes to this. If it works, it works. Use it. Don't spin your wheels trying to do something innovative and creative and that kind of stuff if you don't have to. Making sure that that is all in place. One example again is that D plan, which is the free online program to help museums and cultural institutions write their comprehensive disaster plans. And it's guided and does the risk assessment and operations continuity and public safety and those kinds of things, but it also helps establish planning teams and the leads and conducts training and how to do that training. Completed, so for the Annapolis Disaster and Emergency Management Plan, they also did walkthroughs with emergency management and fire personnel because they were the ones that were going to respond if anything happened. So making sure that they know what's happening. If you are changing a layout, if you are not sure how to install sprinkler systems in a historic building, something along those lines, talking to those stakeholders is important as you're moving through those to develop those adaptation strategies for the future and vulnerable properties. And of course, you have your elected officials, and your elected officials are in influential places, and they're really influential when disaster happens and you're moving through recovery, because once again, as we spoke yesterday, recovery begins at that local lowest jurisdictional level possible is what the federal government calls it, which means it is your local elected officials that are saying, hey, we need more resources than we have within our area. We need county resources. We need state resources. And then you can say, well, actually, we need federal resources if if the disaster has grown to that proportion. The the elected officials are the go-to for community members, and you expect them to represent your concerns. You expect them to be the ones that respond, to be on the news, to be on the radio, to be raising the alarm bells to everybody around you, because of course, disasters don't care about the silly little lines that we draw on maps to say, hey, this is our jurisdiction. Disasters don't care. And so it may be that, yes, you're having this disaster, but your county may have, the next county over may have taken the brunt of it. And so saying, you know what, we actually don't need all of our firefighters. Let's send them over to the next county to help them. Because they need more assistance. So having those open lines of communication and relaying information across those jurisdictional boundaries is also really important as well. So how can local elected officials lead that community in minimizing their disaster risk? One is framing the issue. So making sure that audiences and stakeholders understand what is happening, that they understand that there is a risk, that there is a vulnerability, that we are concerned with economic development or environmental protection or providing that essential public service, and trying to do so in a way that is not super technical, that is not obscure or anything along those lines, that is to the meat and root of the issue. Once again, getting that message out, increasing your visibility to raise awareness is really important. It may be that you have a local leader or a property owner that's well known in your community that you can say, yeah, that's our mitigation champion. Aren't they awesome? Go talk to them because they have some of the resources that you may need. Or, hey, you know, we're going to be at a coffee shop and for about 3 hours, come talk to us. We're more than happy to have a sit down conversation and join us for coffee. And that kind of thing, just kind of that down to earth. And that helps you build partnerships, bringing stakeholders to that table or dismantling the table and taking it to the stakeholders is a great way to get people to engage with your information and to gain that support. Using local technical experts. So sometimes communities are like, oh, well, you're not from here. What do you know? That's okay. That happens. Nantucket's that way sometimes. Oh, you've only been here for 2 years. What do you know? I've been here for 60. It's sometimes I have gotten that response before. But then saying, okay, cool. Let me pull in Holly Bacchus, who is our preservation planner and has been here since the island was colonized. And she could tell you exactly what I need you to know. So using those technical experts to kind of have the in the community is also a great way to address some of this and get your elected officials on the same boat. And then of course, I just realized the image is cutting it off, but make safety and resilience a priority is what it says. And making sure that they understand, hey, yes, we're talking about historic preservation. Yes, that usually means buildings or archaeology or other cultural resource or collections, but we care about you as a person, as an individual, and we want to make sure that you're safe and cared for and protected as well. It's also a really great way. So once again, engage, empower, and act. Support your local leaders, empower them to be influencers and to help their community, and then allow them to enact the legislation to do that, that supports the community and their mitigation efforts, that supports the resilience moving forward. And that way, when disaster strikes, hopefully, they are prepared. They know what to do. They know who to go to. They can ensure that there is a continuity of government, that government is not interrupted during those events, especially because a lot of times government buildings are in downtowns. If a downtown is affected, where does our government seat move to in that recovery process? Are they located at the Catholic Church on the top of the hill that didn't get flooded? Are they going to go to where are they meeting up? Where are they going to make their home base? Activating specific legal authorities, making sure that everything is in order, keeping the media and public informed. So reaching out, knowing how and what to say is important, making sure that they have their elevator speeches ready to talk about, we can do this, and rally the troops and everything else to get that recovery and response started. If assistance needs to be requested, having them be able to request that assistance and allocate resources and know what resources they have to allocate. So having that communication open with your elected officials is really important, especially for heritage and climate resilience and cultural resources, making sure that they are aware of everything. There is so this is from the CDC Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication. There is a process to this, which is outlines a little bit of what we've talked about already. But it's talking about how to maintain that communication, providing background, listening to feedback and correcting misinformation if there are, making and explaining the recommendations, empowering, looking at that resolution. Be honest if there were mishaps and go, okay, yeah, this is a bit of a trial and error process. We realized that this was not, that this trial was an error, and we're going to reevaluate that so that when there is another crisis, another disaster, another whatever is happening, that we don't repeat that. It's always about improvement, is where this is going. And then, of course, as individuals who may not necessarily be in elected positions, establishing your relationship and leveraging those, creating public-private partnerships, knowing what messages you want to get across quickly and what your needs are or your partner's needs are, because your partner may not get the ear of the elected official during a disaster, but you just so happen to get stuck in the same elevator as them. So now you have the ear and can have that little elevator speech for 15 seconds to maintain and engage and establish that relationship. And of course, all of this is about them being able to enact and react to what they need. And it's really important to understand that disaster mitigation does save money. Acting early and being proactive is the best way that you can make your recovery and your response less intensive. It won't completely negate having to recover or respond. It's not going to completely solve all of the challenges and issues. And you may say, oh, hey, we have a hole in our preparedness. Whoops. And being able to respond to that. But it's really about being better prepared so that you are saving lives, you are reducing loss and costs, and you are improving that protection and education and investment even for that. And one such example, I'll refer to Nantucket again. We've done a lot of engagement with Nantucket, which is fantastic and really helps. And one of the things that all of these have culminated in is a group called Acclimate Nantucket. I founded Acclimate in 2019 as a student when I was doing my master's. It's a public-private partnership focused on communication and disaster risk adaptation understanding. And so we talked about everybody who's involved, which is government, our local government. We now have a little bit of state government represented, the yacht club, private property owners, artists, musicians, because public arts is another great way to get some of this information out there and raise that awareness. Educational institutions, nonprofits, researchers, the land banks, conservation organizations are all involved because we needed to get them at the same table. And now we have partnerships in all directions from these people to create these movements, to create these plans that are coming into fruition for Nantucket. And I are able to identify the movers and shakers of the community, of the people who are willing to get stuff done. And then Oregon Heritage has a communication toolkit, which Lisa and I helped form in that. And it's about designing cultural heritage value statements and messagings for communicating the importance of heritage resources in disaster planning and recovery. So they already have those messages. So all they have to do is launch it once those disasters occur, those hazards arrive. So that way elected officials, whoever needs to be notified is notified and understands what is happening in that. And once again, just as a conclusion, disaster planning is essential for the entire community. Preparedness is a shared effort, and making sure that individuals and families know that they do play a role, that government does play a role in their preparedness, they play a role in government's preparedness, will help make this process a little less laborsome for the individual moving through this. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I'm willing and able to take questions or have a discussion about anything that may come to mind.
Anyone have a question? There was a lot of information there. I think Kim underscored quite a bit of the importance of communication, particularly as it relates to your elected leaders. They need to be front and center in the planning process, and engaging them in simple ways is essential. I know we did a little workshop where we had all of our elected officials, our council people, at a little public discussion hosted by our local historic preservation organization. And it was clever. It was titled, "What's Your View?" And View was really about protecting our historic downtown, but protecting it in a way that didn't require building a flood wall. Hence, the visual concept of visual protection of the image and the character, and basically the postcard view of our. So something that just strikes me as being critical. Never going to implement it, never going to get anywhere with the plan if you don't have your elected officials involved and empowered, because their constituents are now better informed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other questions, thoughts? I kind of put in the chat, anyone here that is involved with emergency management or has resources or contact information, that would be great to put a URL in the chat so others can see that information and go to those websites that you are knowledgeable of in terms of emergency preparedness, or any other useful resources for those who are involved in local government or maybe communicating with property owners. So sometime during the day, if you can go ahead and do that, that would be a great resource for us to share with Paige, to share with others. So.
Yeah.
Okay, not seeing any questions or any raised hands at this point. We are actually nearing our break time. So I think what we'll do is just give you guys another couple of minutes here off, and we'll reconvene at 1:15. Look forward to seeing you all again. And again, Kim, thanks for that extensive overview. Jeff will be up next, and we'll get into the rehabilitation design discussion. So thanks much, and see you shortly.
Okay, all right. Let's see. Oh, there's the chat feature. I lost the chat box for a minute, so now I can find it. So to get everyone's blood pumping back from our break, welcome back. This next hour will be a design review exercise, seeing how we can apply guidelines to disaster adaptation for historic buildings. We've had Kimberly's great presentation this morning, and I'm hoping to get some feedback from you and some interactions from y'all. Really, this presentation runs us through a variety of case study exercises, and we'll have a chance to vote on a course of action and see what the outcome was. Hopefully giving you some things to consider before a project like these come before your commissions or come into your community if they have not already. This preservation is interactive, so I'm going to get everybody's blood pumping, like I said, and make sure you've been paying attention to all this great information provided by the presenters over the past 2 days. So if you weren't here yesterday or this morning, as mentioned earlier, I'm Jeff Rosenberg. I'm the Mississippi Gulf Coast National Heritage Area Historic Preservation Coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. And that is a lot of words, a very long title that means I work to promote historic preservation here in Mississippi's 6 coastal counties. In the decade after Hurricane Katrina, I was a technical preservation specialist for the Mississippi SHPO's office, overseeing some National Park Service funded Hurricane Katrina rehabilitation grants for historic properties. And I worked on a similar program in Rhode Island, in the Rhode Island SHPO after Hurricane Sandy. I came back to Mississippi to work on projects associated with the Coastal Impact Assistance Program after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So just a little bit of my background. I never imagined that so much of my career would end up being focused around disasters, but here we are. So yesterday we touched a little bit on applying the Secretary of Interior standards and the National Park Service guidelines on flood adaptation, as these relate to pre-disaster adaptation and then post-disaster rehabilitation. This presentation will give us a brief overview of the standards before delving into these exercises. And these exercises will present some adaptations to buildings that historic district commissioners will or have been presented with. And these exercises kind of focus on both dry flood proofing, elevation, and also implementing a mitigation strategy. We'll sort of focus on elevation because this is one of the things that certainly has the biggest visual impact on a historic structure. But with many folks, I know we had gotten some feedback discussing things like straight line winds and tornadoes. I've also included an exercise about dealing with historic windows in relation to those. The last exercise in today's presentation will focus on a sort of a holistic approach. What is the best plan of action for a specific property example? And how to combine some of the techniques we've talked about that we've seen covered in these guidelines. This is types of information that you want to make accessible to property owners before they come with you for proposal, before a disaster happens. So you can really be in advance of that, and you're not getting caught off guard, when you see a property owner coming in with an application, or even worse, when you see contractors on a job site starting work and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what's going on? We haven't had any applications for that type of work on the property. We covered the FEMA mitigation and adaptation alternatives briefly yesterday, but I'll run through them quickly. From personal experience, I would advise historic district commissioners to at least have a basic understanding of these before a disaster, because in the aftermath, everything will be hectic. Beginning with prevention, planning. This is done through planning and zoning, building codes. Is your community going through a capital improvement program? Are you a part of that? Are there open space preservation and storm water management regulations? The next is property and resource protection. This can be basic property improvements. This can include temporary measures like sandbags and such, both dry and wet flood proofing examples, elevating and retrofitting utility systems, and then ultimately building elevation and then relocation. The next one is a big one, that is structural diversions. This is the creation of physical barriers. These are massive public projects that include flood walls, seawalls, levees, raising the level of your streets, the grade of your streets, while maybe keeping the buildings at their existing level. And as Kimberly covered this morning, we have public awareness and education. That's outreach, notifying new property owners that their building is in a hazard area. Also hazard information centers. We have school-based and adult education, making sure that people in the community know what risks that they're exposed to and what the percentages of those risks, and the fact that that potential can change from year to year. And lastly, we've got natural resource protection for historic landscape features, archaeological sites. This is both preserving natural and archaeological resources through erosion control, living shorelines, streams, and wetland restoration. These are all activities that will also help the built environment as well. Again, like we said yesterday, nature will have a way of recovering. We just need to make sure we're letting it. We're not messing around with it too much. So the exercises in this presentation will really cover property and resource protection, while touching just briefly at the end on structural diversions, like a major seawall or levee project, rather than one that just might protect a single property. Also kind of stress that our examples in these exercises today are not necessarily instructional, saying do this, don't do that, but I'm really sort of asking everybody what their opinions are, taking into consideration the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and the National Park Service flood adaptation guidelines. So looking sort of, do we think that the projects did a good job of adhering to those if this was a building that is in your community? If you were a commissioner, would you approve of this change or not? For folks who did this work, for folks in this workshop, that this has been an introduction to the Secretary of Interior standards. Here are the standards for rehabilitation. There are just 10. They are pointed, but not so specific that they can't be applied to both our country's earliest buildings from the 18th century, like I'm sure they have a lot of up in the Northeast or along the seaboard there. But this is not just buildings like that, but this goes all the way up to very recent history. You know, some of our wonderful mid-century resources that you may have in your communities, modern buildings from the 60s and 70s that we're starting to see added to the National Register. These standards are to be applicable to those buildings as well. These standards should be used as the guide for making decisions about rehabilitating historic places. In Mississippi, the SHPO's office holds a preservation boot camp. It's actually going on right now. This is an event for new and returning historic district commissioners, and these standards are covered. And I believe Paige probably mentioned that there is a similar type of course in Alabama. So the National Park Service guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabbing historic buildings. If you haven't already read this guide, I strongly encourage it. The illustrated version came out in the summer of 2021, just last year. Before that, it wasn't illustrated. It was great information, but it was not as visually striking. It helps a lot more to make it accessible to the average property owner now that it is illustrated, and you can see, a building there on the cover with water in it. That is not the time again to saying, gosh, should we elevate this building or not? It should have already been taken into consideration. So this guide really covers much of what has already been discussed and the exercises that we're about to undertake. Now we'll do the first of our poll, just a real quick informal poll. Who has dealt with flood elevation yet in a commission meeting? I don't know if Marie or who is running our polls, but putting up the poll asking what type of threat you're experiencing in your historic district. This doesn't mean that you've necessarily experienced flooding, but every location is a flood zone. So just asking everyone what type of flooding might your historic district be exposed to. So I don't know if this might be, if you're near the coast, if this is storm surge or coastal flooding, if this is surface water or flash flooding, if you've had riverine, if you're experiencing tornado damage, wildfires, earthquakes. And if you've had another type of disaster, please feel free to specify what type of disaster that might be in the chat. Okay, all right, so it looks like we've still got some people entering, but please continue to do so if you're still thinking about it, and we'll continue. But it looks like tornadoes are the #1 thing here that folks are experiencing. We also have extreme storm events. So, if you've experienced a hurricane, you certainly know that there are multiple tornadoes going around, can be. So it's something that can affect more inland counties. Our next question is another multiple choice, and I don't know if we can put up the poll. But does your commission review, what type of structures does your commission review? Is this a single family or multifamily, or do you have commercial properties? One of those three. I don't know. Oh, maybe I can even launch the poll.
Yeah, Jeff, that one seems to be missing. I did
Oh,
put it
okay.
in, but if people could just put it in the chat, that would be
Sure,
helpful. too.
So just to see, if does your historic district commission only concerned with commercial structures or residential? Single family, commercial? We see in the chat there. So we have both. Yeah, the wonderful thing about a lot of our older districts is they're a mixed use. So not only will you be dealing with thinking about, how to address maybe a slab on grade commercial building. You might also be looking at a residential structure that is raised on piers versus how you would treat a ranch house versus how you might treat a 3 or 4 story apartment building that has commercial on the first floor. So really, trying to think about that, we have multiple building types that we're going to be trying to utilize for these. Okay, so this is the very first building here in our exercise. It is a 1923 colonial revival style utility building. It is a contributing property on the local and national registers. And the issue with this building, the reason that they are coming before the commission is that they've had a problem with reoccurring flooding, high water events which threaten a water pump station in a flood zone. Now, it's really important the flood pumps have to be in this flood zone. We can't move them to another building out of this area. So this has to be mitigated. What is the solution that the owner of this property is proposing? They are proposing to harden and protect the exterior of the building and elevate the pumps on the interior of the building, along with elevating the electrical units that are on the exterior of the building. So this is what they're proposing. The building itself was designed with an arched entrance. We've got arched double hung sash windows and a 6-inch brick skirt wall. So how do we maintain the architectural character of this while giving the structure the flood proofing that it needs? Here was the approach that was taken in this instance. They added, the property owner added the brick extending the water table. So you can see it has taken on a double thickness now. And installed stanchions for the flood shields, which allow for the preservation of our original double leaf door here. But that is a technique that you have to have someone show up at the building before the flood waters are coming in to be able to install those. Here you can see here's a side entrance. Again, the same treatment was used since this wall goes all the way around the entire building. The flood shields, again, have to be installed before the flood event. This is an image of the flood shield in place. So you can see also some photos of the interior and exterior utilities that have been elevated on platforms in case that flood wall is breached. Well, we also see, the exterior utilities, they have been raised above the what is determined to be the potential flooding threat. So this is the building completed. This is what it looks like from the street. From a dry flood proofing standpoint, the execution has been successful with the use of a flood wall and the elevation of utilities. So, but from a preservation standpoint, now thinking from your commissioner standpoint, would you approve this project if this work was proposed and came before your commission? So we've got 3 answers here, or 3 different choices. That can be yes, that can be no, that can be unsure. If you'd like to see different, unsure can be if you'd like to see some additional information, maybe you'd like to see what the options are, or if you have some ideas that if they came before you, that you might encourage them to try doing some other things. So it seems pretty strong in the either yes or unsure. So we have nobody that says, no, this is not in an appropriate treatment. And we'll move into the next slide. And this is kind of setting up what you would see. I can having trouble advancing my slide here. There we go. Okay. So the second poll is related to this project. If these changes were made and you are resurveying your district, would you still consider this a contributing structure to your district? Have the changes been made? Sometimes we cannot avoid having to make the changes to our historic districts, but we can see if we can do that in a way that would still allow the buildings to be contributing to a district. So let's see, so far 100% is yes, that this is still a contributing building, even with the additions of material, giving it that appearance of the wider base. So it is still everybody here seeming to be in agreement that this is something that would be a contributing structure. So we'll move into the next slide. This is for our elevation exercise, and we're looking at sort of 4 examples, because this is a type of topic that so many commissions are interested in addressing, because it can really be the biggest change to a building if you have to elevate it. So we're looking at primarily 19th, 20th century residential and commercial buildings. These are these are contributing properties in local and National Register historic districts. These are properties that are dealing with reoccurring hurricanes, flooding from either riverine flooding or heavy rain deluges. But we also yesterday, Lisa and Kimberly brought up the good points of dealing with a property owner who has a flood in the building next door. They have a burst pipe or something. So if that is something that is a common occurrence that you may need to be able to address these issues with. So the proposed solutions that we're going to see, we're elevating above the base flood elevations for a 100-year flood zone, plus the freeboard, the distance between the bottom of your floor joist to the top of the finished floor. So here we have a 2-story multifamily building, typical for some neighborhoods in New Orleans. Let's take a look at what the property owner decided to do. So here we see they've raised the building a whole story, at least 9 to 10 feet. This went from being a 2-story building to being a 3-story building. And if we can put up the poll, would you consider this a if this became before your elevation? Thank you. If you would vote yes, no, or unsure, would you approve this project if this work was proposed and came before you as a commission? Again, yes, no, or unsure. Would you ask anything, or do you ask for additional information? So we look, pretty much opposite of the other one. We've got a lot more unsures. We've got a couple no's. We do have one yes. But yeah, that is, a lot of unsurety there. And maybe that's in relation to the fact about wondering whether or not the property owner was provided with maybe the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, or if they were provided with, this looks like an issue, definitely getting away from flooding. This is not something they want to be, closer to anything, closer to the sky. So, dealing with, making sure that they can see the National Park Service elevation guidelines prior to their project. Now the next question going on, if the changes were made, would you still consider this property contributing to the district? This would be yes, no, or unsure. So, okay, well, these are some interesting results we're having. Even though folks would not approve that, they're still considering that this building is contributing, just higher up in the air. But it seems kind of pretty equal across the board here. We've got folks really on all sides of this issue. And again, like I said, this is not necessarily instructing you what you should do to a historic building or what you shouldn't do, but guidelines for your community, because a lot of these times it's important during a disaster. If we've talked about, having the input from the local community, what buildings are important, what is, something that the community can really rally around in times of disaster recovery. So, don't feel you have to vote one way or the other just because you see the polls going a certain way. And so this is a great example of that. Here's our next example. Small buildings can be difficult to elevate because, this causes their appearance to double in size. If you have a 2-story building, a 3-story building, it's multifamily, that maybe can make sense. If you have, this small, very small shotgun house that is in an underserved community, it has some unsympathetic additions, some changes over time. This very small building, how do you address some of those elevation issues without making it sort of look like a balloon, that this building's way up in the air on this little spindly foundation. So how might you address that? So here's a photo of it going up. Do you notice any other changes? You know, we've had an opportunity to remove the vinyl siding from the building. There was an unsympathetic addition, that shed roof carbuncle off to the side there that we've gotten removed as part of this adaptation project. Also takes into some rehabilitation aspects. So here it is after they've raised it. It's been terraced, the front elevation, to minimize the height appearance. The removed addition that was incompatible with the district was taken down, and the creation of a new addition that's connected by recessed hyphen there in the construction of a somewhat similar but just slightly different enough. So if we could put up the poll, would you approve this project if this work was proposed and came before you as a commissioner? So, okay, well, we have, again, this is interesting, like the last one. We've got sort of a mix, some yeses, some nos, and unsures. So again, not expecting something to be a slam dunk every time, but providing people with all the proper information that these property owners can kind of decide what they want to improve their properties with. So we'll move to the next slide. This is so the second question. If y'all could put up the poll saying which would you approve if this work was before you, would it still be considered a contributing structure? So here you see the two photographs side by side, one of the building as it existed before Katrina with a very low elevation, and then as it appears today, having been elevated. So we've got again a strong mix, but it seems like yes, that this would still be considered contributing. Looks like no is catching up there, but a couple people unsure. So again, definitely something that you want to have these questions and discussions beforehand, rather than waiting till somebody comes to you with a permit, or again, you see a construction crew out on site making some changes. So another example, this is a slab on grade example. We've got a one-story commercial building. This slab foundation, especially with ranch houses, can be difficult to elevate and make sure they retain their horizontal lines when they're raised. And so let's see what was undertaken with this example. So here's the post elevation. We see it was brought up 3 feet, and this is a preemptive raising. This is something that the owner decided to do. This building had never flooded, but during Hurricane Katrina, the water got across the street, which is, I'm trying to think how far this is from open water, but it's at least half a mile. So it was something that the owner, taking that adaptation encouragement and going with it. So, this example also kind of reinforces the idea of why, as CLG communities, we need to have up-to-date surveys, because this building wasn't surveyed. It wasn't photographed between 1980 and 2007. So I was trying to look for a more recent, a color photograph from the update. You see that past one, it's got sort of, the lounge, 70s, 80s gaslight lounge look going on there. And here it's been restored closer to its original appearance. So again, making sure your surveys are updated. So when a disaster strikes, you have that baseline in advance. So if someone could put up the next poll, this would be, would you consider or would you approve this elevation if it became before your commission? So we've got yes, way out in front, very early on, followed up by unsure and no. So we'll move to the next poll on the slide. If you would consider this property to still be contributing in the district. So we have pretty much strong yeses. We've got an unsure, but nobody says no, these changes or anything that would really jeopardize the historic integrity if it was done. So we'll move on to our next example. Here we have a 1.5-story bungalow, really nice big porch that really expresses this horizontality of the building, something very important to the bungalow style. This sort of out of view of this photograph, this home is on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana, and it's flooded multiple times. So if we turn the camera around 180 degrees, we would see the water just to the south of us. So let's see what was done, what this property owner did. So here they've nearly doubled the height with this building, but the use of materials are the same. And a question to ask here in this instance is, what will be the freeboard? You know, sort of the lowest floor above the predicted floor level. You know, is this something that was done out of precaution? Or as we had mentioned, this building has flooded a lot in the past. So they're sort of taking action here. So our very first question, would you still approve this elevation if it came before your commission? I feel like I'm calling a horse race here because we have the numbers going back and forth, but it's interesting to see. So, you know, it looks like unsure wins out here, and you know, absolutely, you know, maybe you want some more information, why they're doing this, what other mitigation techniques that they could have taken place, maybe not to have to raise that building so high, or there's also the opinion of, you know, okay, you're getting away from the floodwater. What other risks are you exposing yourself to? You have wind upload on the bottom of the building in a place, you know, we've been talking a lot about straight line winds, tornadoes. What other issues come along with that you have to make sure that when people are elevating their buildings, that they're also taking into consideration. So equal yes and no on this one, but unsure wins this poll here. So the other question on this slide is, with this building, would you still consider this property contributing to the district? So right out of the gate, yes takes off, even if people were sort of unsure that this is the appropriate treatment for this historic property, but a pretty strong no percentage as well. So again, this is something that you have to make these decisions. You know, commissioners are the decision makers in their community, and you want to make sure that property owners have this information beforehand, before coming to you. So it doesn't create sort of an antagonistic approach where people really feel desperate. They're trying to figure out how to save their building. They may not be aware of the variety of techniques that they can undertake. As I've mentioned, since we've had a lot of folks asking about, you know, dealing with window issues, especially with tornadoes and straight lines, I've added this slide dealing with window issues. So we've got a nice 1950 Colonial Revival Community Center. It's both a local and national contributing or structure contributing to local and national district. It's also a state landmark. And the issue that they've dealt with is they have large windows on a side elevation that have the impact potential during a wind event. So if someone could put up the first slide, if this project came, I'm sorry, it should read, if this, would you approve this change in windows, not elevation, if that came before you as a commission, would you approve it? So what they did is in place of the wooden screens on the side of the building, they have installed these metal frame impact resistant storm windows. So they did not have to remove the original windows inside there. These storm windows also include a film that doesn't darken the window. It doesn't add any tint, but it prevents UV light from entering the building, which is important because the community center has some really very nice murals by a local artist. They are, I would almost say that they're more important than the building. But this is something that was sort of looking at both a wind issue and a way on a day-to-day basis. How can we adapt this building to address something like more UV light that would damage the art? So it looks like a lot of people say yes, but we still have some no's and unsures. So again, any information that you can talk about, sharing the standards, making those available through your public outreach to help people, understand, not just why these decisions are being handed down, but that they can have a better chance at having them approved when they submit a project. So I'm sorry, I passed our last slide. Would you still consider this property contributing to your district? So we've got 100% yes here. So, and 1 no, interesting, okay. Yeah, I mean, the screens that were removed, those were the original screens dating from 1950. So, again, what amount of historic fabric are we giving up when we're making these changes to the building? So in our next exercise, we're implementing a flood mitigation strategy, and it focuses really on a holistic approach. What is best for a specific property? And this is types of information that you want to make accessible to property owners to consider before they come to you with a proposal. So we have a 1725 federal style house in the Northeast. It's contributing property in a local and national historic district, and it's been dealing with continued flooding and high water events, which threaten this building. It is in a flood zone. I know you can have properties that routinely flood, and sometimes they are not in what would be considered an active flood zone, but this is one that is in a fairly active flood zone. So before making a decision, it's valuable to understand what exactly the risks are that the structure is facing, and how any proposed changes will address them, balanced with complying with these Secretary of the Interior standards. As part of the application, you are able to request a baseline elevation certificate. So finding out, what the base flood elevation level is in this area, and also determining where does this building fall within the flood insurance rate map. What will be the freeboard of the building? What will be the lowest floor above the predicted flood level after the building is raised? And does also take into consideration what your state or community have in design guidelines elevation wise, and do they take into consider the historic nature of this building? So here's a photo of the secondary elevation. It kind of lets you know how much space they have dealing with on an urban lot. Here you see they've got a little room in back, but if they start to elevate the building, they may not be able to necessarily pull it back, because sort of over our left shoulder here is the property line. So they can go up a little bit, but they can't really go back any. Here's some interiors photos of the spaces. As we mentioned yesterday, we've got plaster and hardwood. These are good interiors for dry or even wet flood proofing. Is this building resilient enough if water does get inside that it will be able to literally weather the storm and come out on the other side with some cleaning. So just some basic information about the options for this building. The existing foundation is about 2.5 feet above grade. To place the first floor at the base flood elevation, the house would have to be elevated about 5, almost 6 feet, so about the height of a person. So it would be coming up to eye level on you, to be a total of a little over 8 feet above grade. A new stair would have to be added. We can't jump up into the building. So that's 4 to 6 steps being placed at the entrance. And so again, do we have to move the building back? Are we allowed to build steps out onto the public right of way? Taking those into consideration of what they would look like. To place the first floor level 2 feet above the base flood elevation to reach the design flood level, the house would have to be elevated, almost 8 feet to a total of 10 feet above grade. So, now we're starting to talk about you're walking by this building and you're starting to look at the underside of it if it's on a pier foundation. And to be able to get to that, you'd have to add quite a few more steps. We're adding another 6 to 8 steps placed at the entrance. So here is mitigation option number 1. And what does this include? This would include abandoning the basement, filling it in to prevent flooding down there. It would also be including flood vents into the walls of the building. There would be sump pumps to pump out the inside to make sure you have equal pressure in there. You would have to elevate the systems. That means if you remember the photographs from yesterday of showing the hot water heater being put into a closet, elevated in a closet on a platform, your heat pump and your electrical utilities on the exterior of the building, those have to go up on a platform as well. And also considering, if we're going to be attaching this to the building, what issues do we have with vibration coming into the building from a unit like that? So does it have to be something that's freestanding? Can it be attached to the building? So here, we're looking at examples of abandoning the basement, abandoning that lower level, and elevating the utilities. And there are some pluses and minuses from this from a commission review standpoint. I will ask everybody here, do you think this creates a visual intrusion? Are we doing anything to the exterior of the building that we can't maybe tuck around to the back? So option number 2, this is a combination. It would be elevating the building, but include some wet flood proofing on the lowest level. So this would be to elevate the first floor 4 to 6 steps above the sidewalk. So that means the first floor is still below that base flood elevation. We'll have to move the building back. So we're moving it off its original footprint to accommodate the new steps out front. We'll undertake some of the same measures in strategy number 1 that we had talked about. So that existing foundation at about 2.5 feet to be placed, the first floor at the base flood elevation, the house would have to be elevated again, about eye level, and then to get to that 8 feet above grade and having that new stair. So you're looking at options. And what are some of the pluses and minuses from a commission review standpoint? Can we think of any visual intrusions that come with this kind of mixing of these two strategies? We'd have to, if we're allowing for some wet flood proofing, we're introducing the vents into the building. Is it something, knowing where we have to add these? Is it something we can add to a secondary elevation, or are they going to be on the primary one? Things that you have to think about before approving these changes. Obviously we're raising the building, but what other wet and dry flood proofing things do we have to include? Is making sure you can have somebody that can be at this building and deploy the flood barriers in the event of a potential flood coming along. This is strategy number 3, and again, another combination. It would be elevating the building, but rather than flood proofing on the lowest level, this side is being raised with fill, so you don't have such a large increase visually in the elevation. Essentially, not so much essentially new building. You're not looking at new foundation or something else that was put there other than fill. So with this slide, the plan is to elevate both the building and the site. You're having to move the house back on the lot to create a front yard. That's so you can have steps both to get to the elevated new grade site of the building and also get into the building as well. And you may not necessarily have to move it as far back as this building has moved, but you still need to allow for some space for this increased stair step here. So they've elevated here. So the grade, the base flood elevation, there is the floor is above what they are expecting to have flood-wise coming through. And then not only have they built this sort of little retaining wall, they filled that in with grade. So it doesn't stand out so much as this is being a preventative measure. It looks more like a yard. So this is taking the building right to the base flood elevation. So floodwater that has a 1% chance of equaling or exceeding that level in any year. So again, as we talked about yesterday, that 1% chance does go up every year, but this example would meet their basic requirement for that 1% chance of flooding. Now, option number 4, we're going to go above what that base flood elevation is. But does this work for our colonial style building? You know, we have an open foundation here, which is quite different than what was there, sort of a rubble stone foundation. So this first floor is being elevated 2 feet above the base flood elevation. The new foundation is open, so this house is on posts. So, you know, water coming through, it might be able to pass through without creating any damage to the structure above it. There's a setback from the front sidewalk to allow space for the entrance steps. This is certainly a much grander staircase than what we saw on our previous example. So if you can sort of imagine that colonial building there, rather than having sort of some wrought iron and stone stoops here, we have this wonderful sort of grand staircase looking like something from Gone with the Wind, maybe. Is that appropriate in this instance? You know, existing, as we had talked about before, the existing foundation is about 2.5 feet above grade. To place the first floor level of this building, you would have to elevate it 7.5 feet. So it's 10 feet above grade. Again, you're walking by this building and you're not just looking at a stone wall this time, you're looking at the underside of the building. And so there's things to consider with this option here. Our fifth strategy would be to construct a flood wall. So this is an option that would have to be combined with one of the other options, since we really can't build, flood wall can only work up to about 3 or 4 feet. And with our building example, we have to have a base flood elevation of above 8 feet, I believe. So here in the strategy to construct a flood wall, we have a wall around the perimeter of the site. Again, it's only addressing flooding up to 4 feet in height. So if you have 5 feet of flooding, your flood wall doesn't do you any good. The site is still flooded. And again, you have to have somebody there. So this can't be a building off site. If you are responsible for a half dozen properties, you may not have time to get around to all of them to be able to put up all these flood barriers prior to the disaster taking place. So we have our option number 6. This is a property that has to have this is an option that you'd have to have every property owner buying in, agreeing to do the same thing. So having a whole neighborhood approach, and that's something, especially with public outreach, you have to do this because you can't have it piecemeal with people deciding to elevate their structures like this. So this would bring up all the buildings in a historic district. This is elevating the surrounding grade. This is elevating the surrounding infrastructure, your utilities, your gas lines, everything that is coming into the house has to have new system to be able to get into the house now. Also, this might include some stormwater management systems that are improved district-wide. So you have a couple of larger scale things that you have to consider. This can't be necessarily a technique that one person decides to do on their own. So here are all the choices. They're not necessarily, again, a right or wrong choice or a specific combination that works in every instance. But if it comes before you, these are the options that you'll have and the choices that you'll have to make. It might be best to ask, in this instance, what you may or may not approve. But if there was one that you had to encourage the property owner to select, or say, we would approve this if it became for our commission, what would you select? So there are 6 options. This is a little bit more different than yes, no, or maybe, as we've seen with our previous one. And again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong approach in this situation. So we've had, plan to flood coming in, this example, a very old building with natural materials that can take, being inundated with water. Another question that you may want to ask is, how long do these periods of flooding take place? Is it something like a storm event where water comes in with a tide and then leaves within 8 hours, 12 hours? Or is this a situation where, our building may be below grade in instance, and we see flooding that could stay for days or weeks at a time? So kind of, understanding those questions, what specific types of flooding that you may be dealing with, and taking those into consideration. So it looks like we've had about 14 people respond. So nobody chose Elevate with Freeboard. Nobody wants to see the piers under this building, to be able to look through. So I think we're all in concurrence with that. But as you can see, there are a lot of options and something that you can take into consideration, that not one of these tasks is necessarily a silver bullet, what will fix your problem, but having sort of different options that you can combine and sort of mitigate necessarily having to elevate the building so high up in the air, how you can address some of those things. So let's see, and I think that was our last exercise there. So I really appreciate everyone's time today and over the past 2 days, and spending your time answering these poll questions. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me or any of our presenters today. I know we're going to have a little bit of a wrap up. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those, or we can open it up to all the presenters to be able to answer questions for us.
I have a question.
Great. Christian, go ahead.
Some of the choices that were given on making changes due to flooding, like say with the bungalow in Louisiana and this federal building in the Northeast, some of the choices actually change the personality and the period of the structure itself. Isn't that kind of contravening what historic preservation does? I mean, smaller changes, yes, but that's no longer a bungalow, really, is it? It's a raised cottage, it looks like. And then the federal building, when it almost changed centuries in one of those choices. Is that okay, or is that a silly question?
No, that's an excellent question, and something, as Commissioner, you're going to be faced with. And so you rather say, I want to ask what I might think is a silly question now than thinking about it once you have to adapt that. So with this example, the bungalow example up on the screen, they applied one approach. So that means they just elevated the building. In this instance, there was no consideration to, are we going to raise the grade? And that can minimize some of the idea of how high we're going to have to elevate the building. There's also other, flood proofing options, whether that's wet or dry. So maybe considering trying a combination of those things. There may be other buildings in your community that you can look for how people have historically addressed flood proofing. Or I'm sorry, not flood proofing, but issues with flooding. Or if we're talking about tornadoes, I know there have been instances how people have addressed tornadoes historically. In the 1930s in Tupelo, Mississippi, there was a terrible tornado that went through, and a lot of people that rebuilt, they rebuilt their homes out of concrete. So you see some historic adaptations. Those are sort of clues from the past, how people might have addressed that. So some changes to these buildings, we know, no place is a snapshot, just frozen in time. We do know buildings change and evolve over time, how they change, how they grow, how the community uses them. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, sort of one solid approach, but kind of looking around your community. What are other ways? What are historically appropriate ways? What are ways that keep the feel of your community? Because here, like you said, with elevating this building, does it so much detract from the historic nature of the building and the buildings surround it? Does the community want to consider, okay, we need to elevate the entire grade of our community, so our buildings, we're not walking around staring at them, 500 feet up in the air, that kind of issue. So, again, I want to stress, as I've mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is that these are not saying do this, don't do that,
Yeah.
But these are options of examples of, looking just sort of what you may have to consider when someone comes to you with their presentation. Because in a situation, with this example specifically, this homeowner had experienced repeated flooding, and it's sort of that knee-jerk reaction of, I can't deal with this anymore. I got to get up out of the water. I got to get out of here. And so, having a lot of these guidelines are a huge help, especially the flood elevation guidelines from the Park Service, that we can say, okay, wait a minute, here we have some guidance. And really going again, because I think a lot of people, a lot of commissions, and the reason that guideline was created is because a lot of people are saying, we're having changes that seem so drastic. This change means that the building doesn't look like what it is. But if it continues to flood, it goes away. It ends up having to be demolished, and it doesn't look anything like it would at all. So this is saving the resource, but also having those guidelines to fall back on is something that's going to make sure, if it is a National Register listed property or eligible property, that it stays maintaining on that register, and you're not saying, gosh, we've made so many changes that this building is no longer contributing to the district.
I think too, when you're looking at older buildings, if you've studied the architecture of older buildings on the East Coast from the late 18th century, you see where they built wings on, and it really did change the personality of the building when they built it, but they were in a new century. And so you kind of blend that into the structure's history. This wing was built on, it may not have been conducive in the 1700s, but this is 1800s when they built it. Does that make sense?
Right, absolutely. And so, you're looking at things like, are we having a continuation of materials, or do we want to go in the opposite direction and have something, totally different? The National Park Service does give some guidance on use of materials like that. If you want to have something so drastic to denote there was a change, because this is going to be, especially if your community has experienced a disaster, that is a drastic, thing that's going to be embedded in people's minds. And even if all the old buildings survive, any new construction that come in might be addressing that. So it's telling part of the history of your community about how things had to change and adapt over time. Certainly, you look at pictures from the mid 19th century and you don't see any telephone poles or power lines. But if you look in the early 20th century, 19 teens and 20s, you see, power lines all over the place. And sometimes we go, gosh, how did people even stand that? So, we do have some changes in growing over time. So I hope that answers your question.
It does very well.
Okay.
And Christian, I'd add a couple of things that gets to the practical application of your commissioner. What are you looking for in your evidentiary packet when you're making the consideration? Because as Jeff was alluding to, there's a lot of considerations just first off from the design perspective, what does the flood elevation certificate indicate? What is your base flood elevation? And to understand that is, your 1% chance area, that's your line. But then the freeboard, and the freeboard is something that FEMA does require to have in the floodplain ordinance. And in some communities, particularly in Louisiana now, it could be up to 3 feet on top of that. So that implication is significant to you as a commissioner, because it is driving the design. It's driving that elevation that architect has come up with. But when we start looking at the simple features, the very large, massive front porch, is that actually in proportion and scale to the rest of that building as elevated? Are the columns and piers overly large? Could they be, smaller in size? Do they line up with the existing columns on the building itself? So there's a lot of design considerations you have to look at when you really start to get into the details, like that front approach. We had a staircase that went straight up to the front entrance door. Well, now we're coming off to the side and doing kind of a dog leg up. Is that really the best approach to the entrance to the house? Was there any other consideration for other ways to approach the property? It's now reading more, as Jeff alluded to, vertical than the horizontal that is the typical bungalow. Is there a way you could have done landscaping around that, or more mature landscaping to hide that area in the bottom, or to seal it off, or to make it appear as if it's diminished into the landscape? And now you have that horizontality back. But also remember, and this is very much my experience in learning about Charleston, a lot of this is being driven by the flood insurance. You know, these individuals are realizing higher and higher rates in their flood insurance. So between working with the architect, the property owner, and the good, thoughtful review of the commission, you should be able to come to some balance and some understanding about what is in front of you in terms of your applicant's needs and their desperate needs to protect that asset. And what is your responsibility as a commissioner to ensure the integrity, those 7 factors of integrity remain to tell the story about that property and its historical evolution. So all things to keep in mind.
Okay, that's good.
Other questions, other thoughts? Kim, do you have anything else to contribute in regards to some of these difficult design decisions that we have to make as commission members or staff?
Yeah, really also looking at what other communities are doing is really beneficial. When I was doing my master's degree, I was looking at 3 different communities, Nantucket, Charleston, and Schenectady, New York, to see how they were dealing with this issue of elevation. Because like Jeff said, it's one of the most intrusive adaptations that we can possibly do other than completely moving the building. But how they managed that elevation was really significant and matched up to their architecture. So the elevation design guidelines for Charleston and for Schenectady, New York were before the National Park Service's new flooding adaptation guidelines. So they were kind of doing this on their own, and South Carolina doesn't even really have a historic preservation plan in place either as a state. So Charleston was tackling this issue and trying to think about it and thought about how their board already operates, what they have seen previously, what they know that they don't want to see, such as parking underneath the building. And that kind of stuff. Schenectady made the same decision. You cannot put in a garage. You cannot park your car under your building if you're elevating it significantly enough. And Schenectady is not coastal. It's a riverine community. The river feeds into the I think the Hudson, either that or St. Lawrence River, one of those. But that was their decision. And St. Augustine is going the same way of, no, you cannot park your car under your historic building. Sorry about it. Nantucket also made that where elevation would have to be high enough that could allow for vehicles under the building. Nantucket also said, absolutely not. Looking at different ways to disguise it and making sure that those are landscaping that is friendly to the environment. So not planting invasive species, not planting non-native species, because they may not survive your climate. They may not fit in. They may cause an ecological issue or spread, such as I know Nantucket absolutely loves its privet, but the privet is not great for the environment. It does not help absorb any water. And so there's a movement to encourage more native plantings that actually do absorb water and improve the building's resilience. So a little bit more of those hybrid approaches as well really help. And that's something that Schenectady built into their design guidelines for elevation. And I think Boston did a little bit of it, especially along their waterfronts. And quite a few other communities now have started to include these more hybrid approaches of looking at landscaping and making sure that you can absorb water and that wave impact, slow the water motion down a little bit to increase that resilience as well.
So I appreciate all the comments of the team today. And one of the things, particularly on this last design exercise, I kind of want to wrap up with is the importance of actually now having the Secretary's guidelines for flooding, because before that, we were all trying to kind of second guess how this would work. Interesting thing about the guidelines as well, there is a section in the back that talks about alternative strategies, everything from being able to lift houses during events to other ways of approaching it, i.e. moving properties, relocating them, and sometimes just the materials issue. We've dealt with that a lot. You know, FEMA really wants to see materials below that base flood elevation, that 1% chance elevation, that are more flood resilient, are not traditional materials. And there are some communities that are saying, you know, that's okay. It's not part of the historic character of the building. We should go ahead and support property owners that are looking at putting that in because it is FEMA compliant. And it's something we're not concerned about because it is new construction and it will look different. And it's supposed to look a little bit different, but still be compatible. So there's other considerations you have to have beyond that. But again, use that guidance or use guidance that is provided on property types that are similar to those in your community. And I guess one of the first things I would recommend is if you have the ability and you're updating design guidelines, that you really include a section on disaster preparedness or resilience, whether it's tornadoes or any type of flooding, inundation, disaster event. So with that, I would just say that the resources that we've got available, the toolkit in particular, you'll see a lot of design guidelines provided in that. And Marie, that is something that I know we're going to be sending out. We typically do a group photo and we don't have a lot of you all showing your faces, but I really would encourage you at this point in time before we sign off here. One thing we do at every camp is a group photo. So if you all could please just turn on your cameras, as many of you as possible, so we can grab that quick shot. And I'm so glad to see some faces. This is just wonderful. Look at smiling faces. This is great. Obviously, you've all been very attentive during this. So thank you so much for that. We'll see if we can get a few more of you just turning this off before we conclude. And again, if you all have not yet put in the chat your AIA or APA, AICP information, if you want the certificate to be sent to you, Marie does need to have that in the chat. We'll be sending you the toolkit. Marie, what else are we going to send everybody?
Well, we are going to send a link to a camp evaluation so you all can let us know how we did today. It's always very helpful. And as Lisa said, the toolkit, I'll also be sending a link to the recording and the presentation slides as well. And the recordings will include the little chat bar on the side. So you can find resources in there. And it's good to see all of your faces. I recognize a few from past camps. All right, well, I'm going to give you a little countdown, and then I'm going to just take a quick screenshot, and we always share these on our Facebook page. It's just a little tradition we've started. All right. I'm going to count 3. All right, 3, 2, 1. Ooh. Somebody just came on here. Charles. All right. Charles is joining us. All right. Oh, Bryant. Anyone else?
See, everybody wants their picture taken.
2 empty spaces up next to Bryant and Charles. They are lonely down there. Anyone want to join them? All right. All right. 3, 2, 1. Smile. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for being such a great audience today.
Great. Thank you all. And look forward. If you ever have any questions, please do contact us. We're there to help. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.